He was born with rhythm in his bones, and a name that would one day echo through reggae halls around the world. From the narrow streets and sun-baked yards where children learned to sing before they could read, he emerged not as a fleeting voice, but as a presence. As a young man, he carried a simple conviction: music could lift a life, make sense of suffering, and speak truth to power. That conviction became the quiet engine behind every verse he would sing, every chorus the world would remember. He did not arrive fully formed. His early years were shaped by the pulse of Kingston, the creak of a wooden gate in the rainy season, the hum of transistor radios that bled American soul and Jamaican mento into one another. He learned to listen before he learned to perform, listening to elders, to sound system selectors, to the way a harmony could soften a hard day. Those harmonies would later fold into his records like old friends dropping by, familiar, reassuring, and necessary. When he first stepped into studios, the equipment smelled of dust and promise. Microphones were still vessels of surprise. Sometimes they captured lightning, sometimes just breath. He leaned into them with the steady cadence of someone who had spent years polishing his instincts. His early songs carried both caution and hope. They were not designed to flash or to shock. Instead, they insisted on something deeper: conscience. He wrote about the soil, the children, the injustices that cropped up like stones in a field. Those themes, earth, family, righteousness, became fingerprints across his catalogue, signatures no remix could fully erase. Success, when it arrived, felt like recognition rather than reward. Radio plays multiplied, and songs traveled beyond their warm island origins to find listeners in distant rooms, cars, and clubs. For many, a single chorus became a compass. Lyrics repeated like prayer, a voice that could steady lives shaken by politics, poverty, and displacement. Fans called him a voice of the people. Critics called his music both earnest and stubbornly traditional. Neither label fully captured him. He was, above all, an artist who would not fold his messages into slickness for the sake of charts. He was not immune to the industry's pressures. The path from studio to stage is littered with compromises, management disputes, publishing headaches, and promises made in smoke-filled rooms that evaporated by morning. There were tours that paid in delays, and nights when the accommodations did not match the billboard. Yet he met those tribulations with a stubborn pragmatism. He learned where to protect his work and where to concede. Even when contracts were thin and payments thinner, he kept writing because the songs were a ledger of what mattered. As fame grew, so did rumor. The world loves a neat narrative: the rise, the fall, the comeback. In his case, the trajectory was messier. There were stretches when he seemed less present, fewer interviews, fewer festival invitations. Fans asked the same question in different languages: what happened? Some answers were simple, some layered. There were creative lulls, seasons when inspiration retreated like tide. There were also moments when personal priorities shifted: family obligations, the desire for privacy, and the slow, patient work of tending to one's spiritual life. He moved through all of it the way he sang, without theatrical collapse, with the dignity of someone who understood that life and art do not always line up conveniently. At the same time, the man behind the microphone became a reluctant symbol. His songs about love, resistance, and conscience made him an informal ambassador. Community organizers sought him out for benefit shows. Youth groups wanted him to speak at rallies, and audiences expected him to represent more than his own life. He accepted some invitations and declined others. The weight of expectation is not visible on a record sleeve, but it presses on the artist in ways voters never see. He was careful not to let public demand swallow his creative compass. The music itself did not stagnate. Even during quieter periods, he kept refining his lines, rearranging harmonies, and finding smaller, truer moments to sing about. Collaborations with younger producers surfaced like new blooms, modern rhythms braided with classic phrasing, an exchange between generations rather than an abandonment of roots. He welcomed those collaborations selectively, choosing projects that felt authentic rather than opportunistic. When he returned to the studio with new material, listeners noticed a tempered urgency, songs that retained his unmistakable timbre but arrived with a renewed sense of purpose. There were controversies. No career of consequence escapes them entirely. missteps in interviews, rumors about behind-the-scenes spats, and the inevitable online speculation that follows anyone who steps out of the spotlight. For each rumor, there was an alternate explanation rooted in the mundane: miscommunication, contractual snafus, the slow grind of touring logistics. In private, he took these things in stride, understanding that public life magnifies small errors into headlines. He relied on close friends and a small circle of collaborators to filter decisions and to keep him honest when the echo chamber threatened to feel like reality. What many people did not see were the quiet rituals that kept him steady. Days carved out for family, late-night walks to clear the mind, the kind of reading that fed lyrics rather than ego. He believed in the long game, not fame, but faithfulness. That belief shaped the decisions that often puzzled outsiders: choosing a modest label over a flashy deal, turning down a lucrative but shallow collaboration, or spending months perfecting a verse rather than rushing it out to meet a trend. Those choices sometimes limited his commercial growth, but preserved a continuity that would define his legacy. His impact is measured not just in record sales, but in small, stubborn ways. The teenager in a rural town who learned to play guitar because one of his songs said it was worth fighting for an honest life. The community garden project that used one of his anthems as its unofficial soundtrack. The overseas radio host who introduced a generation to the cadences of his homeland. Those are the quiet afterlives of music, less glamorous than awards, but more lasting. As the years folded into one another, he adjusted to a different kind of visibility. He accepted invitations to mentor, to sit on panels, to lend his name to causes that aligned with his values. In interviews, he often pivoted from self to story, from ego to context. He spoke about reggae as a living tradition, one that needed caretakers and risk-takers. He urged the next generation to listen to the elders, but to write their own chapters. That advice, simple and urgent, became an extension of the work he had always done, nurturing continuity without suffocating innovation. People often ask whether the real story is tragedy or triumph. The truth is less cinematic and more human. His life contained both losses and victories, private griefs and public applause. What was really happening behind the scenes was ordinary in its complexity. A man making art, making mistakes, healing and moving forward. He did not vanish so much as realign himself with what mattered most: creativity anchored in conscience. In the end, his story is an invitation. It asks listeners to reconsider what success looks like and to recognize the costs and rewards of staying true to a voice. He kept singing because he believed songs could outlast crises and console those in the storm. He kept writing because silence would have been a betrayal of the stories he had promised to tell. His catalogue remains as testimony, not only to talent, but to endurance, to the idea that music grounded in truth can weather the distortions of fame. Those who follow him now do so with a deeper appreciation, not because he disappeared, but because he chose a path that many confuse for disappearance. He chose roots over rapidity, meaning over momentary virality, and community over celebrity. That choice shaped both his public arc and the private life that sustained him. The untold parts of his story are not mysteries to be solved, but lessons to be held. About the patient craft of songwriting, the ethical demands of representation, and the quiet courage required to keep singing when applause softens. His name still appears on playlists and festival posters. His voice still enters rooms like a familiar guest. For those who listen closely, there is an underlying message that threads every track: that dignity matters, that resistance can be melodic, and that the truest legacies are built not on headlines, but on the daily work of being faithful to one's art. What really happened to him then was not disappearance but deepening, a maturation that transformed a popular singer into a cultural keeper, quietly influential and profoundly human. He kept a careful inventory of his songs the way some people keep letters from old lovers, stacked by meaning, sometimes revisited, sometimes deliberately left unopened. When he wrote, he thought about rhythm as weather. It could break a drought or flood a plain, and each arrangement mattered. He favored simple structures that left room for a vocal to roam. He understood that the space between notes often carried as much truth as the notes themselves. Producers who worked with him learned quickly that patience in the booth was not an indulgence but part of his craft. A line might be sung dozens of ways until the right breath, the right crack, the right grain of feeling arrived. Live, his presence was less about spectacle and more about reciprocity. He did not dominate a stage so much as invite it to participate. Audiences felt that invitation and answered with their own stories. A mother swaying with a child asleep on her shoulder, fishermen in caps who had traveled from out of town, students reciting a chorus with the solemnity of prayer. Those nights were not the kind of viral moments engineered for clipping. They were slow accumulations of attention, an exchange that left both singer and listener altered. Backstage, he collected names and shared recipes and sometimes asked about the audience members' children. For him, knowing someone's small life was a way to keep the larger themes of his songs rooted in human detail. He also learned to navigate the modern hazards of music, streaming algorithms, truncated attention spans, and the constant churn of new releases. He watched some peers chase trends, altering sounds to fit playlists, and he admired the ingenuity even when he chose a different path. He experimented in ways that respected his voice, subtle electronic textures beneath horns, a sparse drum machine holding court behind an acoustic guitar, always viewing technology as a tool rather than a replacement for feeling. These experiments sometimes baffled critics who expected purity. He welcomed the bafflement. It meant he was still talking, still provoking thought. The matter of influence weighed on him in private. Younger artists named him in interviews and covered his songs. They lifted phrases and polished them into hooks for a new era. He took such moments as both compliment and responsibility. He offered guidance to those who asked, lessons about persistence, about fair dealing with managers, about insisting on credit and correct royalties. He sometimes sat in on songwriting sessions, suggesting a chord or advising a melody. He rarely took a producer credit. The joy for him was in the passing of knowledge, like a teacher who prefers the classroom to the plaque. There were also limits to his availability. He resisted the idea that accessibility equated to usefulness. When his schedule permitted, he lent his voice to charitable events and educational programs. He provided resources where he could and used his platform to raise attention for issues that aligned with his worldview: food security, music education, and the protection of cultural spaces. But he refused to be a celebrity mouthpiece for every trending cause. He judged invitations by whether they were rooted in durable relationship or transactional optics. That discretion sometimes frustrated event organizers, but it preserved the integrity he valued. Behind the public persona, he was a careful negotiator of time. He learned to hold certain hours sacred: the morning pages of handwriting where lyrics first took shape, the afternoons for family and gardening, the evenings for slow listening sessions. He found that boundaries were not walls but fences that allowed both art and life to breathe. Friends described him as steady, not because he avoided storms, but because he attended them with the sober focus of someone who had seen many seasons. That steadiness did not make him immune to doubt. It made him practiced in confronting it. When controversies arose, they were seldom about the music itself. They tended to be about the ecology surrounding music, rights, distribution, and the erosion of artist control in the face of endless platforms. He advocated for better practices, joined with colleagues to push for clearer contracts, and used interviews to emphasize education for young artists. His rhetoric remained rooted in dignity. Artists should be paid fairly, credited honestly, and taught to treat their work as both spiritual and economic labor. Those positions won him allies among veteran musicians and younger activists alike. There were quieter chapters too, songs that never left his notebook, ballads written for old friends, lullabies intended for children who might never hear them publicly. He recorded some of those pieces alone, with nothing between his voice and the mic but the sound of breath. He considered releasing them as a private collection, but ultimately chose to give them away, played at small gatherings in nursing homes, at benefit concerts. These moments were less about preservation than about presence, music used as a bridge between lives rather than a product to be monetized. The arc of his influence is visible in surprising places. He volunteered time teaching in community centers. The kids there took to him because he listened like someone who believed words could plant gardens. Musicians who had once been his opening acts became collaborators on later albums. DJs who had spun his singles in the 90s now curated festival stages where he served as elder statesman. That continuity, the passing of one generation's songs into the hands of the next, was perhaps his proudest achievement. He had not simply been a voice, he had been part of a living stream, a current of cultural memory that continued to move. As he looked toward the later years of his career, he thought less about labels and more about legacy in its truest sense. Usefulness. He wanted to be useful to the people who had been useful to him, family, friends, those who had stood in the heat of festivals, and those who had recorded in rooms where the air smelled of coffee and varnish. He set up small initiatives rather than large foundations. Scholarships for music students, a modest studio where emerging artists could record at low cost, and workshops where technical staff could learn the ropes of modern production. He measured these efforts not by headlines, but by the number of nights a young artist slept easier, knowing a session had been paid for. In interviews, when asked about mortality or the end of his career, he often returned to the same metaphor. A song is a seed. Whether it flowers or not is not entirely up to the planter. All an artist can do is prepare the soil and leave markers for those who will follow. That humility framed his later work. He made music with a sense of continuity rather than conquest, a feeling that what he offered belonged to a broader community of makers rather than to his own name alone. There were brief flashes of mainstream attention, an anniversary reissue, a well-received documentary feature, an unexpected sync on a popular show that reignited interest. Those moments created new audiences who found him with fresh curiosity. He met some of those newcomers with gratitude and others with bemusement. The passage of time had taught him to take praise with the same evenness with which he took criticism. He had come to understand that attention is like weather. It comes and goes, and the work continues regardless. In the end, the Untold story resolved itself not into a tidy moral, but into an ongoing practice. The practice of attending to music as vocation and community. He continued to write, record, teach, and show up when his presence could be meaningful. He protected the parts of his life that fed the work and let go of the parts that did not. For listeners who wanted a scandal, there was none. Only the more interesting reality that someone could choose a quieter life without abandoning the music entirely. And so, decades into a career that had bent light and held storms, he moved forward as he always had. With a steady breath, a note set free, and a belief in the small, stubborn ways music can change a life. The question of what really happened dissolved into something richer, a story of fidelity to craft, to community, and to the enduring conviction that a righteous song can outlast even the loudest moment. He kept listening even when the world seemed to have louder things to say. Old songs returned to him like letters found in a jacket pocket, faded at the edges but still legible. When younger artists reached out, it was not always to borrow a line or a hook. Sometimes it was just to ask how to survive, how to say what needed saying without losing oneself. He answered with the sort of blunt tenderness that only comes from seasons of making and unmaking. Learn your craft, learn your numbers, and learn to be kind to your own voice. Those conversations were small but accumulative, like the practice of tuning a guitar before a long set, necessary, grounding, and often overlooked. Travel continued to shape him. Airports, small-town venues, and late-night radio interviews gave him constant reminders of music's surprising reach. He met people who translated his words into different languages of grief and hope. He learned that certain sentiments, care for the earth, the ache of longing, the righteous insistence on justice, traveled without losing their core. Those meetings altered his sense of audience. It was not a statistic anymore, but a mosaic of faces and dialects, each one carrying the weight of a different world, yet singing the same chorus. He embraced that multiplicity with the humility of someone who understood that a song's meaning is often completed by the ear that hears it. Medical concerns appeared, as they do for everyone, and he addressed them with the same methodical care he applied to music. He adjusted touring schedules, delegated more often, and learned to accept that rest was not cowardice, but strategy. Those adjustments shifted the rhythm of his public life. Fewer marathon tours, more residencies where he could stay a week in a city and let the music sink in. Residents of those cities remember evenings where he sat on a simple stool and told stories between songs. Stories about first records, about dreams deferred and dreams acted upon. Those nights felt like confessionals and classrooms rolled into one. Collaborations kept surprising him. Young producers brought unexpected textures. Older musicians brought patient improvisation. He found joy in trade, handing over a familiar lyric and receiving it back in a shape he had not predicted. Those exchanges often led to small epiphanies, a bass line that reframed a verse, a harmony that revealed a new harmonic truth. He did not mistake collaboration for compromise. He treated it as a laboratory where the criteria were honesty and curiosity rather than novelty or bite-sized virality. His public statements remained measured. He spoke about systemic problems with a clear eye for solutions: better legal protections for artists, community investment in arts education, and the creation of local spaces where music could be learned and played without the pressure of immediate profitability. He refused the narrow dichotomy that plagues many conversations, either art as pure protest or art as mere entertainment. For him, songs could do both. They could hold grief and propose repair. That insistence, simple as it was, attracted a coalition of allies across generations and geographies. Family life, meanwhile, recentered him in ways that translated into his work. He was present for small triumphs and small tragedies alike: birthdays, illnesses, the ordinary calendar of care. Those experiences altered lyrics in subtle ways. A line that once seemed political acquired tenderness. A chorus meant to mobilize a crowd became an intimate address. The evolution was not abandonment of principle, but an enrichment of it. His songs began to carry the weight of lived tenderness alongside their moral urgency. He continued to make choices that confounded industries and delighted communities. He sometimes released music outside of conventional channels, distributing a track to community radio and local centers before uploading it to global platforms. He hosted listening sessions where the only requirement was the willingness to sit, to listen, and to speak afterward about what the songs awakened. Those sessions were radical in a quiet way. They resisted the fast food consumption of culture and invited slow attention. Critics reassessed him more than once. Some outlets praised the longevity of his voice. Others questioned his commercial priorities. He paid attention to neither critique nor praise more than necessary. Instead, he used reviews as a mirror, noticing what was emphasized and what was omitted, and letting that observation inform, not dictate, his next move. He was not arrogant about his place in music. He recognized the privilege of having a public platform and the obligation that came with it. As time advanced, mentorship formalized into structures. He partnered with technicians and local educators to teach not just performance, but the ecosystem of music: how a gig is built, how a contract is read, how sound is balanced. The emphasis was on sustainability, teaching artists how to keep making music long enough to matter. He preferred hands-on training to speeches, believing that craft is caught as much as it is taught. His relationship with spirituality deepened, shaping the cadence of his later records. Prayer, ritual, and the search for meaning became audible in his phrasing. He did not proselytize. He simply allowed his convictions to color his work with a steadier hue. That depth made some songs feel like sermons in which mercy and accountability sat beside one another, uneasy but necessary companions. Listeners responded, sometimes with debate, sometimes with gratitude. For him, the point was not unanimous agreement, but the provocation to think and feel more fully. He witnessed a younger generation reimagining reggae in ways that honored the past while staking claims to the future. He felt both nostalgia and exhilaration, an understanding that traditions thrive when they are remixed, borrowed from, and respected. He invested in that future not by clinging to a bygone sound, but by teaching the old techniques that made new forms possible: timing, groove, the art of space. Those teachings were modest, but potent. A drummer learning to leave room, a singer learning to let the phrase breathe. Through such incremental transmissions, his influence threaded into the fabric of new music. When he walked off stage for what some called a final bow and others called another night, it was impossible to tell which it would be. He did not announce grand retirements, he simply paced his work differently. He published a small memoir, not a blow-by-blow of scandal, but a mosaic of memories, each vignette chosen for its lesson rather than its capacity to amaze. Readers appreciated the restraint. Reviewers called it a document of a life lived with ethical patience. In quiet moments he returned to the earliest promptings that had set him on his path, the scratch of a pencil on paper, the way a chorus could settle an anxious household, the sound of neighbors harmonizing in the street. He revered the ordinary as fiercely as he did the extraordinary. That reverence informed his last records in meaningful ways, songs that did not try to be epic, but instead sought to be true. What really happened, finally, was less dramatic than many imagined and more consequential than headlines could capture. He remained a maker, sometimes visible, sometimes not, always attentive to the world's rhythms. He chose a durability of purpose over the volatility of fame. He measured success by continuity, the number of people he had taught, the small studios sustained, the kids who kept picking up instruments. Those metrics are quiet and slow, but they have a way of reshaping culture over decades. When people ask now about the untold parts of his story, they often mean the soft work. Tending relationships, mentoring, setting up structures that do not flash but endure. Those efforts do not make for viral clips, but they make for legacies. He left behind songs that continue to be sung in kitchens and on stages, and he left behind a practice that music can be both a weapon against injustice and a medicine for the weary. In that double function lies the heart of what he became, a keeper of tone, a teacher of rhythm, and a voice who taught listeners how to stay human in noisy times. He kept making choices that prioritized depth over breadth, and those choices shaped how history would remember him. Awards came and went, some accepted with gratitude, some declined with a polite refusal when the ceremonies felt misaligned with his principles. But they never dictated his direction. When institutions recognized him, he thanked them and then redirected attention to causes he cared for, using the moment to amplify others rather than to inflate his own image. That behavior baffled publicity teams, but endeared him to people who believed that recognition is best repaid by service. There were moments of unexpected joy that felt almost sacramental. On one tour stop, a small crowd of local schoolchildren surprised him with a chorus they had learned by heart. He stood listening, hands folded, as their voices turned a song into a communal promise. Afterward, parents pressed thanks into his palm. He kept the notes and later framed a single crumpled drawing in his home studio. Those tokens were trophies of a different sort, proof that music had circulated, taken root, and begun to sprout in hands not his own. His notebooks, when opened, revealed an artist attentive to tiny textures, single lines that might become refrains years later, awkward metaphors struck from whole songs, scribbles about rhythm and timing. He revisited those pages like a gardener returning to a field, pulling weeds, planting seeds, and allowing long arcs to develop. There was no panic in the repetition, only a practiced faith that songs, like crops, follow seasons. He taught young writers to respect drafts and to expect revision, to treat each version as a lesson rather than a failure. Sometimes, humor diffused the seriousness of his work. He loved to tell a self-deprecating story about an early studio session when a mixer had accidentally reversed a vocal take, and it sounded like a chorus sung by ghosts. The crew laughed for days, and he used the story in interviews to remind people that even sacred work had room for laughter. He believed levity was a necessary companion to conviction. Without it, righteousness could calcify into dogma. He also learned to be disciplined about money, a practical skill he felt too many artists ignored. He took classes, asked blunt questions of accountants, and made sure that younger colleagues understood the basics of budgeting. He framed this as stewardship. If music was a spiritual offering, then financial stability was a way to sustain the work without becoming dependent on the mercies of others. That practical wisdom quietly shifted the lives of several protégés who later spoke about him not only as an artistic influence, but also as a mentor in adulthood. The recordings themselves became a study in balance. He preferred analog warmth where possible, Yet he did not fetishize the old over the new. He sought sonic textures that felt honest, room reverb that placed the listener near the body of the drum, a vocal take where breath punctuated meaning, a bass line that moved like a conversation rather than a monologue. Engineers learned to listen for the small things he valued, how a guitar sat behind the rhythm, how a backing vocal could lift the chorus without crowding it. Those production choices contributed to a sound that critics described as timeless, even when it incorporated contemporary elements. At times he wondered about the weight of expectation he had inherited from earlier generations. Reggae had always carried the burden of history, a music born of struggle, resistance, and hope, and he felt both honored and wary of that weight. He did not want to fossilize the genre by enforcing a single aesthetic. Instead, he saw his role as stewarding its values while allowing evolution. This was why he invested in mentorship and in small studios, to create spaces where the tradition could breathe and become something new in the hands of each emerging artist. Confessions came in private letters and late-night calls, artists admitting that their careers had derailed because of bad contracts, producers asking forgiveness for earlier misjudgments, young parents asking advice about balancing touring with family. He responded with practical counsel, and sometimes with concrete help. Those acts were not publicized. He preferred that the record of his generosity remain in the memories of those he aided, rather than in press releases. For him, influence was a relational currency, spent in service and replenished through continued attention to others. Retrospectives on his career eventually appeared in magazines and on panels, and journalists sometimes framed his arc as a mystery solved. The artist who stepped back and refused the trappings of celebrity. He accepted those narratives without correcting every detail. There was a humility in that acceptance, an understanding that public stories simplify in order to travel. He used such moments to reiterate his real aim, to teach longevity and to normalize a career defined by sustainment rather than spectacle. In his later collaborations, he allowed space for vulnerability in ways he had not earlier. Duets were often recorded live in the same room, capturing the friction and warmth of two voices finding a common purpose. He sang with journalists turned musicians, with activists who brought spoken word into gaps between verses, and with children whose unrehearsed voices brought an immediacy that polished singers could not replicate. Those collaborations reminded him, and his audience, of the joy of surprise in creative work. The final stretch of his public life, to the extent there was any finality, was characterized by an ease that some misread for withdrawal. He was selective but present. He performed at benefit concerts that matched his commitments, sat on panels that aimed for systemic change rather than platitude, and continued to teach in ways that required actual labor, sitting in studios, adjusting levels, explaining the physics of sound. He enjoyed less the trappings of stardom than the routine of craft. When he considered how he might be remembered, he did not imagine statues or lists of hits. He pictured small studios that stayed open because someone had paid the rent for a month, kids who learned chord shapes because someone sat with them patiently, tracks that sounded the way they had intended because engineers had honored the space between notes. Those were the benchmarks of success he cherished. And so the conversation about what had happened to him shifted. It stopped seeking scandal and began to notice the steady accumulations, the mentorships, the small institutions, the songs that became rituals in church halls and kitchens. People came to see that staying true to one's art could look unremarkable on a news cycle yet be revolutionary over time. In that revelation, his life became a model for others who sought to do meaningful work without surrendering to the rhythms of sensationalism. His last public statements, unflashy, deliberate, returned to a theme he had voiced for decades. Music is a trust. It is entrusted to those who make it and to those who keep it alive in listening. He reminded listeners that songs matter less as products and more as relationships. That reminder felt radical because it asked people to slow down, to listen, and to act with care. It was, in the end, the most fitting coda to a life spent insisting that music could be a map for how to live, with attention, tenderness, and a stubborn refusal to be reduced to a headline. Even when his voice quieted on the airwaves, traces of him kept resurfacing in unexpected places. Liner notes in reissued vinyl, a sample tucked into a hip-hop beat, a student essay that quoted a line as if it were scripture. These small echoes multiplied into an ambient presence that never quite matched the blunt immediacy of fame, but was no less potent. Archivists and fans dug through crates and hard drives, finding unreleased takes and demo reels that painted complementary shades onto the public portrait. Those finds were not scandalous. They were clarifying, showing an artist who tried, failed, revised, and tried again. The unearthed tracks often startled listeners, not because they revealed secrets, but because they revealed process, the tentativeness before conviction, the false starts that preceded a true line. In those ragged textures, people recognized the work of someone who had long prioritized truth over polish. Letters accumulated, handwritten notes from listeners who described a particular song as the thread that had kept them in a rough season. He read some aloud to friends and tucked others into a drawer that smelled faintly of sandalwood and paper. He kept them not as trophies, but as reminders. Words mattered, and the practice of singing them with care produced consequences neither performative nor immediate but deeply human. He often repeated a refrain from an old mentor, "Make something that outlives your vanity." That admonition framed his days as much as any critical theory or commercial strategy. He also recognized that history remembered in fragments, and that those fragments required context. He partnered with small museums and cultural centers to help curate exhibits that presented his work alongside the instruments, flyers, and ephemera that made a scene legible. He preferred modest displays, labels that told a story without spectacle, because he trusted that artifacts could speak if given the right frame. Young curators found in him an eager collaborator, someone willing to sit for hours discussing which postcard mattered and why a particular photo captured more than an outfit. Those projects were not about canonization, they were about making the past teachable. When debates rose about authenticity in reggae, who had the right to call something roots, who qualified as a steward, he mostly stayed out of the fiercest exchanges. He sometimes weighed in gently, offering definitions rooted less in gatekeeping than in practice. Does the music listen? Does it hold accountability? Does it make room for others? Those questions redirected arguments from purity tests to practical ethics. He believed that music's legitimacy came not from rigid adherence to form, but from its capacity to hold truth and to be generous in its pedagogy. There were documentaries that approached his life with different emphases. Some focused on the music, others on the politics, and a few on the intimate details of domestic life that had shaped certain lyrics. He participated selectively, preferring filmmakers who asked to observe rather than exploit. The best pieces were small in scope, but generous in attention. A film that traced the making of a single album, a short that recorded a day in a community studio, an oral history that let collaborators speak more than the subject. Those projects did for public memory what his mentorship had done in practice. They offered scaffolding on which others might climb. Conversations with peers often revealed a quiet consensus. He had refused the binary offered by so many cultural scripts, sell out versus stay pure, and had instead tried to enact a third path that favored continuity. That path required different skills, negotiation, patience, and a stubborn willingness to take unpopular stances when they preserved long-term possibility. Younger artists watched that model and learned a career grammar that did not promise overnight stardom, but did promise resilience. He also came to see the limits of influence. Not every lesson he offered found an eager ear. Not every intervention prevented a collapse, and not every initiative succeeded. He had losses, projects that failed to gain traction, protégés who drifted away, investments that turned sour. He catalogued these failures with the same fair-mindedness he applied to drafts, as data to inform the next attempt rather than indictments of moral character. That posture, practical, unromantic, and forward-looking, was perhaps his most underrated legacy. It taught people to treat an artistic life as a set of experiments rather than a single climactic achievement. He aged with the peculiar dignity of someone whose profession rewards practice over mere novelty. His voice adapted. It deepened where it once soared, found new textures in restraint, and conveyed wisdom without defeat. Critics who had once weighed his relevance in chart positions began to calibrate their metrics differently. They started to ask, how many people learned to play because of one song? How many spaces stayed open because of a small fund? How many neighborhood festivals included a reading of a lyric? Those metrics were harder to quantify, but more telling of cultural endurance. Small festivals honored him with lifetime awards that he accepted with a short speech, not to celebrate himself, but to spotlight the young artists who needed stages. He used the spotlight as leverage, announcing grants, naming apprentices, and directing media questions toward structural issues rather than personal accolades. Journalists learned to expect this. An interview with him would often pivot from a question about a hit single to an earnest conversation about artist education. He made it habitual, and in making it so, he nudged the discourse toward the things that sustained communities rather than the things that sold them. The rumors of retreat that once fueled tabloids dimmed into a more accurate story, a reorientation. He had not disappeared. He had invested in different currencies, time, labor, mentorship, currencies that do not translate neatly into likes or headlines, but that buy more durable goods. A student who can read a contract, a studio that will pay a technician a living wage, a community event that raises funds for instruments. Those were modest interventions, but they multiplied into ecosystems. Toward the end, when he spoke of beginnings and endings, he often returned to gratitude. Not a triumphal gratitude, but one shaped by the knowledge that art had been both privilege and obligation. He thanked collaborators in interviews, acknowledged the invisible hands that had helped him, and named the colleagues who had taught him humility. He framed his success not as a personal victory, but as shared property. A song belongs to those who listen to it, and to those who keep it sounding. The last public performances were not ostentatious finales, but continuations, sets at charity events, relaxed evenings with peers, and surprise appearances at community centers where parents and kids were already gathered. Those nights felt like the arc of his career distilled, small stages, attentive audiences, and the sense that music was a practice rather than a spectacle. After one such night, a young musician approached him and said simply, "Your song taught me to keep going." He smiled, folded the statement into himself, and reminded the young player to keep a ledger and a diary, practical tools for an artistic life. In classrooms and studios, he left an instruction that sounded simple and yet held the tensile strength of his life. Do your work thoroughly and treat others well. That counsel betrayed no romantic illusions about fame. It was a manual for durability. People who had followed him for decades recognized the quiet revolution embedded in that manual. A cultural life does not have to be loud to be effective. The archive of his work, records, notebooks, letters, and small films, slowly found new homes in libraries and community centers, places where they could be studied, played, and acted upon. Scholars wrote papers, musicians made pilgrimages, and teenagers discovered old singles on streaming services and were surprised to find that the songs sounded like they had always been present in the background of their lives. That sense of discovery is one of music's gifts. It can arrive late and still reshape a life. He died when he did, surrounded by familiar faces and the sound of inside voices that had shared decades of practice. There was no shrill end, no sensational postscript, only a slow gathering of people who had been taught or healed by his work. Tributes poured in, not as a net to catch the mythic, but as a quilt stitched by many hands, small, practical, warm. People spoke about afternoons in studios, about lessons that had nothing to do with chord charts, about the patience he modeled in domestic and public life alike. In the quiet that followed, new artists invoked his name as one might invoke a useful tool, not as relic, but as resource. They sampled, covered, and taught his songs, and in doing so, they extended a lineage. The question of what really happened matured into a subtler inquiry. How does one practice a life in music that cares for others as much as it demands from them? His answer, arrived at through decades of modest, consistent work, was both practical and radical. Tend your craft, pay attention to the people around you, and let your influence be measured in lives improved rather than cliques amassed. That legacy, finally, feels less like a closed chapter and more like an instruction manual for anyone intent on making music that lasts. In the years after his passing, his work continued to do what it had always done quietly. It entered lives in private ways and rearranged them. Community radio shows built playlists around his records, and school teachers used lines from his songs as prompts for essays about responsibility and place. A young activist referenced a verse at a rally, not because it was famous, but because it fit the weather of the moment. The cheap cassettes and now dusty CDs that had carried his voice for decades lived on in kitchen players and glove compartments, small reliquaries of meaning. Curators and archivists worked with the materials he had entrusted to others, notebooks, session reels, correspondence, to build resources that taught process rather than myth. These archives were used by students of music and by organizers trying to create sustainable arts economies. Grants that bore his name often emphasized the nuts and bolts of music making. Stipends for rehearsal time, funding for sound engineers to apprentice, and support for small venues to keep doors open. Those pragmatic investments proliferated in neighborhoods where music had once been the province of a few, making room for many more voices to be heard and sustained. Conversations about his place in history shifted from rhetoric about comebacks and disappearances to questions of craft and community. Musicologists wrote about his approach to phrasing as if it were a dialect, a set of choices that could be taught and practiced. Workshops used transcriptions of his most elusive lines to demonstrate how emotion is carved into rhythm. In those lessons, students often discovered a surprising humility in his technique. Restraint could be more difficult than display, and the simplest phrase, repeated with patience, could become incantatory. He became a reference point for a kind of career that had previously gone unnamed. Mentors who worked with emerging artists pointed to his life as proof that a sustainable practice is possible. They told stories about the time he insisted on fair splits for co-writers, or about the small stipend he arranged for a young engineer, and used those instances to train newer cohorts in an ethic of care. Schools teaching music business began to include case studies drawn from his choices. Contract language he favored, community initiatives he modeled, and his insistence on literacy for artists. Those curricula shifted conversations from celebrity to stewardship. At festivals and in liner notes, younger musicians cited him for what he had given rather than for what he had taken. Covers and reinterpretations proliferated not as attempts to capitalize on nostalgia, but as pedagogical acts. Each new reading asked what a line might mean in a different year, a different city, a different struggle. Some covers stripped arrangements down to reveal the lyric skeleton. Others reimagined grooves to show how the core sentiment could dance in new rooms. The multiplicity of these reinterpretations testified to the elasticity of material he had created. Robust enough to hold many hands, generous enough to invite alteration. Even in debates that surrounded genre and ownership, his life offered a gentle corrective. He had long argued that traditions survive through openness rather than gatekeeping, and his example encouraged conversations that emphasized cross-pollination while respecting origin. Collaborations that once raised eyebrows between roots singers and producers from other continents, between community choirs and electronic musicians, found frameworks in the practices he preferred: clear agreements, shared credits, and mutual respect. Those frameworks became models for ethical collaboration in a global music economy. The small institutions he helped birth or buoy, community studios, educational trusts, apprenticeship programs, proved durable. They grew in fits and starts, often weathering lean years through the same kinds of grassroots investments he had championed: local benefit shows, volunteer time, and the careful budgeting of modest endowments. Their survival mattered because they provided the scaffolding for music to continue being made outside of market imperatives. For many artists, these spaces became the difference between a season and a career. At conferences and panels, his name often came up as shorthand for an alternative ethic. Speakers referenced him as someone who had modeled how to be generous without being naive, how to be principled without being rigid. Those conversations had ripple effects. Managers who had once optimized for short-term streams began to consider longer-term strategies for their clients, and some labels experimented with advanced structures that mirrored the practices he endorsed. In personal recollections, stories repeated not as cliches but as blueprints. Their promoter remembered how he always checked that local crew were paid. A fellow musician recalled how he stayed behind after a show to help pack gear. A mentee told how a single afternoon in a studio had changed the arc of a career. These memories accumulated into a large ordinary portrait, someone who treated work as relationship and who treated people better than many in his position would have. That portrait, when shown to younger artists, provided a map for how to balance ambition with responsibility. His songs continued to be used in ways he might have approved, as lullabies, as protest anthems, as soundtracks for quiet gatherings. They became part of domestic rituals and civic rituals alike, a testament to the fact that music's power is often most evident in repetition and use rather than in spikes of attention. Those songs living in playlists and on sticky notes continued to do the small work of shaping moods and moving feet. Ultimately, the answer to what really happened moved from the register of mystery into the register of method. What happened was a sustained practice of making and tending, an ethic enacted through countless small choices, a life that turned the philosopher's question of how to live into a daily curriculum. He offered a model that valued the music itself, the people who made it, and the communities that received it. In that model, meaning accrued slowly and usefully, and legacy was not a monument, but a process, ongoing, responsive, and alive, in the hands of those who continued to play. If one listens now, carefully with attention to space and breath, his voice is still audible in the seams between songs and the pauses between phrases. It inhabits the textures of rooms where people learn, where instruments are tuned by hand, and where songs are taught from elder to novice. The story of what happened ends not with a single explanation, but with a living, breathing practice that continues to be taken up, revised, and passed on. That is the truest untold story. Not disappearance, but the patient work of keeping music and humanity in conversation. He remained present in the small rituals long after the headline cycles had moved on. People who had once been background characters in his story, roadies, sound techs, local promoters, found their own lives altered by the steadiness he had modeled: better pay, clearer contracts, a newfound refusal to accept exploitation as inevitable. Those ripples mattered because they changed the conditions in which music could be made, and making better conditions was one of the less glamorous but most effective ways to keep a tradition alive. Academic interests surfaced in unexpected corners. Ethnomusicologists and cultural historians began to study not only the hits, but the methods: how he taught timing in a studio with shaky meters, how he negotiated performance splits in markets that had no established norms, how he balanced spiritual conviction with the pragmatics of touring. Papers were written not to canonize him as a myth, but to extract usable practices, techniques that could be taught in conservatories and community colleges alike. Those studies translated into syllabi, and classrooms that once mouthed glossy narratives now practiced the small, repeatable actions that had sustained his career. Record stores that had once stacked his singles on end racks found new curiosity from collectors and casual listeners alike. Reissues came with liner notes that prioritized context over celebrity: who helped record a particular bass line, which neighborhood inspired a bridge, what the original mix smelled like when played on a particular console. Fans treasured those details because they revealed the collaborative scaffolding of music making. The stories appealed to people who wanted to understand the labor behind the lyric, rather than consume a packaged legend. Philanthropic efforts carried his name into neighborhoods that needed neither spectacle nor press. Grants in his honor tended to be modest and directed: a month's rehearsal pay, a sound technician apprenticeship, a monthly stipend for a community radio show. The framers of these grants took a cue from his tastes: less about grand gestures, more about consistent, reliable support. Beneficiaries spoke of the compound interest of small investments. 1 year of steady rehearsal translated into a career 3 years down the line. Those outcomes were the quiet proof of an ethic that trusted time and steady attention. The model he left behind influenced managers and producers who had once chased the quick spike. Some switched strategies, crafting multi-year development plans for talent, insisting on transparency, treating touring crews as partners rather than expendable lines in a budget. The industry in small places began to resemble the ecosystems he had always preferred: artist-centered, ethically negotiated, and attentive to craft. That shift did not erase market pressures, but it provided a counterweight. Young artists learned to think in seasons rather than headlines. They learned to measure success by the thickness of relationships rather than by a single viral metric. Film and theatre makers kept returning to the texture of his life for inspiration. Plays staged entire acts in a single studio room, tracking the making of a song from first scribble to finished take. Films used the arc of his choices, the refusals, the small generosities, the long mentorships, as scaffolding for narratives about what it means to be an artist in a commercial age. Those adaptations often trimmed, rearranged, or fictionalized details for the sake of drama, but they carried a through line that remained true to his ethic: art as practice, art as relational labor. Internationally, his name became shorthand for cross-cultural respect. Musicians from other traditions sought to emulate his method of collaboration: clear agreements, credited contributions, and the willingness to sit and learn from elders. Those practices helped prevent exploitative sampling and predatory promises because they insisted on a prior conversation about value and credit. In a digital era where sounds travel without names attached, his insistence on naming collaborators felt both old-fashioned and urgently necessary. At home, his family continued to steward the quieter parts of his estate: the notebooks, the demo reels, the odd cassette labeled in a hand that got sloppier with age. They worked with local institutions to make sure those materials were accessible to students and practitioners rather than locked behind corporate gates. Their choices reflected his long-held belief that music should be shared and taught, that the archive had a responsibility to the living scene as much as to posterity. Unpacking the full scale of his reach never produced a tidy map. Influence branched in odd directions: a community garden organized after a song about soil, a radio show that adopted one of his phrases as a signature sign-off, a local council that cited a lyric when arguing for more youth arts funding. These small appropriations were not always authorized, and they did not always pay royalties, but they did reveal the porous way that music circulates through life, how a single line can become a household instruction or a protest slogan, depending on who sings it and where. For younger artists, his life remained a study in craft and code of conduct. Workshops that taught his phrasing and timing also taught negotiation and bookkeeping. Mentorships that emulated his approach paired young singers with veteran technicians and promoters to learn the unglamorous mechanics of a career. That pedagogy, borrowed and adapted into institutions, created cohorts who were less enchanted by instant success and more prepared for long careers. Finally, the narrative settled not on events but on disposition. He had not engineered a grand strategy for posterity. He had simply lived in ways that favored care. That disposition, steadfast, attentive, and generous, became the most portable element of his work. People could imitate a riff or a dress sense, but what he taught was a way of attending, to a rehearsal schedule, to a partner's livelihoods, to the tiny economics of a sound check. That attention, practiced over decades, accumulated into a field of influence that kept producing fruit long after the louder moments had faded. When historians wrote about him, they sometimes opened with facts of chart positions and festival bills, but more often they ended with the things that mattered in kitchens and community halls: a song hummed by a child, a studio kept running, a career that did not burn out. That was the scale at which his life made the most durable difference. The untold story was not a secret so much as a slow revelation. Meaningful work looks ordinary in the moment, but transformative in the long view. And that is exactly the kind of story his music, steady as a heartbeat, patient as a season, was built to tell.